during this year, we've been involved in a number of housing projects, housing initiatives, as it was Dr. King's maiden voyage to Chicago around the issue of fair housing. And since then, through the creation of Operation Breadbasket, Operation Push, and now Rainbow Push, Reverend Jackson has continued that work here in Chicago and around the country. And we have, as part of our panelists today for our housing initiative, a person I've grown to appreciate and have a great deal of respect for. His name is Jim Cunningham, and he is the Midwest Deputy Regional Administrator for HUD here in the Midwest. Welcome, Jim Cunningham.
Thank you, Bishop. It's a pleasure to be here on behalf of the Biden administration and our Secretary, Marcia Fudge. My job, as you said, is the Deputy Regional Administrator for the Regional Office of HUD. We cover 6 states, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan. And I am responsible for the delivery of HUD programs throughout the 6-state region. I oversee 6 other field offices, including the Chicago regional office. So I have staff in each of those offices, and we make sure that we provide housing assistance and deliver HUD programs for the great people of the Midwest.
Well, I want to start there because a lot of people do not know exactly what HUD does and what the functionality of HUD. As a former public housing resident myself, as a child, and then as I've matriculated through our work at the Rainbow Push Coalition, there are so many different perspectives and perceptions about HUD. And I guess a lot of people don't know what HUD does until they need HUD. Similar to the work we do with Reverend Jackson, they don't know us until they need us. Tell us a bit of what the functionality of HUD is, and what are some of the programs that you oversee that people just don't know unless they need them.
Great. Yeah. So we do a lot at HUD. The simplest thing I think that we do, that I always say, that we're a funder and a regulator, right? So we provide a lot of funding for both housing and community development programs. You mentioned public housing. So we are responsible for providing primarily capital funds and operating funds to public housing agencies. In Illinois, for example, there's 117 housing authorities throughout the state that we provide that money to, so that they provide housing, either through traditional public housing, what we've known, it doesn't necessarily exist anymore. The Cabrini homes, Robert Taylor homes, you think of those, but they also do housing choice vouchers, which allows folks to rent on the private market. Our other big program is actually on the private side, where we've been engaged at Concordia Place. They're privately owned, and we provide a Section 8, we call it a housing assistance payment contract. So we have a business agreement with these private owners to make sure that they provide decent, safe, and sanitary housing, and that in all of our rental programs, residents pay 30% of their income for rent. So those are the big kind of housing provider programs. We also work with state and local governments. We provide grants through the Community Development Block Grant Program. It allows from a wide range of services to communities, whether it's public services or public infrastructure. We also run the Home Affordable Housing Program. We work with homeless providers to provide housing assistance for those experiencing homelessness, whether it's through emergency shelters, but primarily we try to get them into permanent supportive housing through the Housing First model. The other program you mentioned, Reverend King's fight for fair housing, we enforce the Fair Housing Act. That's one of our primary functions. So we take complaints and we either investigate them ourselves, or we work with state and local agencies that have the same powers to enforce the Fair Housing Act. We basically insure lenders against default, which is a vital step to increasing home ownership. We're clearly trying to, under this administration, trying to close the gap between Black and brown homeownership and white homeownership. That gap is, unfortunately, it's actually higher than it was 50 years ago when Dr. King started the fight for fair housing. So we have a lot of work to do, but we're going to come up with policies to try to break down those barriers, use the FHA to allow for more minority home ownership. One of the things that's vitally important is that we not only people pay their rent, but they have a decent, safe, and sanitary place to live. So we make sure that all the housing that we support provides decent, safe, and sanitary housing. So we make sure that owners or housing authorities are living up to that commitment because of our funding.
Well, one of the things that's interesting is Secretary Fudge seems to have her finger on the pulse of trying to empower persons to become first-time homeowners. And it appears that she's been able to secure dollars through some of the various bills to fund that. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that where people miss it is the generational dynamic, the cycle dynamic of public housing, where you have two or three generations that cycle through public housing and seemingly never get out of it. And it seems as though through the Biden administration, there is an attempt to reset and give individuals a real chance at first-time home ownership in a way that has not existed before. And the benefit of that is it affords communities to grow in an exponential way. Home ownership speaks for itself. It creates a tax base. It creates opportunities for investment and recapitalization, but it also affords kind of a beyond the emotional aspect of it, a real sense of wealth building, which is critical to Black and brown communities. Talk a little bit about her initiative and some things that that bring direct benefit to individuals and communities as a whole.
Right. And I think, thanks for that question. And I think one of the biggest things is, regardless of funding, it's breaking down the policy barriers. We've seen her double down on our fair housing enforcement. You may have seen recently, we've seen that the difference in appraisals. So we're enforcing the Fair Housing Act that when people are appraising homes, we're seeing that some appraisers are lowering the values for Black homeowners. So it's ultimately important that we make sure we do that job first, is enforce the Fair Housing Act and make sure that everyone's on a level playing field, because we know from history that's not the case. Second, a couple other policy barriers. We've just treated the way we look at student loan debt differently when we're doing FHA loans. That's vitally important, because when we're looking at credit, one of the biggest barriers is a credit score and having bad credit. So we're looking at those policies to make sure that those are eliminated. If you look at the Biden administration's proposals under the American Jobs Plan, there are tools to both reinvest in communities, particularly distressed communities, through homeowner rehabilitation programs, grants to state and local governments to help fix those homes up and make them available to first-time home buyers. One of the other things that we're talking about is extending, a typical mortgage is 30 years, but if we extend that to 40, that lowers the amount of payments that folks have to make over time. So it makes homeownership more affordable. The other policy is zoning. There's a proposal in the American Jobs Plan to give incentives to communities that take a look at their zoning policies. I just read an article recently where, like, in most of our major cities, 75% of the land is single family use only, which prohibits multi-unit developments, which are often less expensive. So we're looking to incentivize communities to do the right thing and allow for different types of housing that's both green and friendly, but also affordable to the average home buyer. So we're taking a long look at that. There's a lot of policy initiatives in the American Jobs Plan that offer incentives to put a lot of housing stock back on the market. So I think it's vitally important, and we're looking at ways to do down payment assistance through either the home program. One of the second biggest barriers is coming up with that down payment and how we look at it, particularly in FHA, the things that we we can control. So there's, like I said, there's multiple facets of things that we're trying to do to increase access, level the playing field, making sure that everyone has the same shot at home ownership. Because as you said, it is the way that we build wealth in this country, and everyone should have access to that.
When you talk about leveling the playing field, one of the things that we experienced, and on behalf of Reverend Jackson, I want to commend you and your staff, top to bottom, when we saw the conditions at Concordia and we responded to the calls from the tenants and the tenant council. It was refreshing how you and your staff came in the midst of the height of COVID in Chicago to respond in person and otherwise to give a sense of empowerment to the tenants. And one of the things that I learned is that the average resident in public housing does not know what their rights are, how to, how to go about using those rights to right or wrong, if you will, or to get some sense of some sense of resolve. For example, if it's recertification, or if it's a condition of a unit, or if there's a management issue, we were great. We were incredibly impressed with the fact that staff came right on without hesitation to show tenants what to do, how to do it, even in many instances teaching the owner or showing the owner or instructing the owner on what they must do equally to empower. And I think there's a misnomer about HUD by the average individual, that there is a means by which you actually empower, equip, educate residents and tenants in public housing, so that there is not this sense of us versus them, or they are to some extent exiled from the rest of the community wherever these properties exist. Talk a little bit about that, because I don't think many of the residents didn't know. Many of the people we talked to didn't know, and there is a process of balance, but I think the disconnect is it's almost like you don't know all the fire department has to offer until you have a fire, right? You don't know the ladder truck, you don't know the pair, you just don't know they can bring a wellspring of resources just by dialing 911. But if you never have to do it, you never need it. And I think that's at the ground level, it gets lost, that residents feel like the only way that they can engage in change is in a leasing office or in between them and owner and management. And yet HUD has a number of tools that do level the playing field. Talk a little bit about that process.
Sure. First, thank you for that. And I think that the first thing I want to say is that I think every American deserves a right to live in a decent, safe, and sanitary home and live there without fear, right? And I think I've said this before, that I think a lot of tenants live in fear that because they receive subsidized housing or someone else is paying a portion of the rent, that they don't have a voice. That's just simply not the case. We make sure that we actually have documents called residents' rights and responsibilities. They do also have a responsibility too, right? They have to live up to their end of the bargain, but they do have a voice. And if something's not going right, they need to know what options they have. And it depends on the type of housing, but there are vehicles for them to make sure that work orders get completed, that their certification, they're paying the right amount of rent. In our multifamily business, these are the privately owned. Mostly we have a contract administrator in all 50 states that that administer that contract, or HUD. And they are the first, well, first of all, the first stop should always be your leasing agent, right? Whenever you have a problem, you should be able to go there and it should get resolved. It should. I'm not naive enough to think that it always gets resolved. So whether it's a public housing authority, an on-site manager, but that's the first place that people should go. But like I said, on multifamily side, the privately owned, we have contract administrators. They help us. And if people don't talk and if something's going wrong, we don't know about it at HUD. And so that's kind of like the first place to go, because that helps us. We call it building an administrative record. So if we have an owner that's not doing what they're supposed to do, then we know. And you can always, if that doesn't resolve things, you can always call HUD. We're in every phone book, and our website is a wealth of information. We are there to make sure, even during COVID, we are returning everyone's phone call that calls it. It may not be as quick, but within 24 hours, we're calling people back. So residents should not ever live in fear. If they complain to HUD, they will not be retaliated against. And if they are, we need to know about it. But their voice is very important. And, no one knows better the condition of a property than someone that's living there. We don't, we have a lot. I mentioned all the programs at the beginning. We have a very large portfolio of HUD assisted households all across the country. And we can't realistically, even though we do annual inspections, we can't be there, and things change. Even if we do it, when we do our inspections in a timely manner, that's just a point in time. So the residents really need to have a voice. They have a voice, and there's several mechanisms for them to call if they're in a housing authority. These are public bodies. They have a board of commissioners. They have annual, monthly meetings of the board. So there's ways to have your voices heard. And I think everyone, I've said this at the first meeting we had at Concordia, everyone deserves the right to live with dignity and respect. And that's being respected when you have a problem and trying to get that problem addressed.
It is so very, very important that on this subject matter, that if you have a family member that lives in public housing in a senior building, they're receiving any type of federal subsidy or federal dollars, it becomes important that you become engaged, involved, and educated in this. And you can see at the bottom of the screen, rainbowpush.org, or you can even call us directly in Chicago at 773-373-3366. I want to thank him for sharing with us today and being a part of change. Now, oftentimes, the challenges of working government and organizations like Rainbow Push can sometimes be combative and confrontational. In this instance, it's been a collaboration that's brought about a great deal of constructive change, not just here in Chicago, but around the country. And I hope that you will share this, like this, and comment in your networks about this, and do what we're asking you to do. Get involved, get engaged, and become educated about this. The whole idea that we're in a country now where we now are in a position to have greater access to capital, greater opportunities to build wealth, and ensure that the quality of life is not just for somebody, it's for everybody, is a role and a responsibility all of us can reach. And so as the National Field Director for the Rainbow Push Coalition, guess what? We're keeping hope alive.